They laughed at his FBI badge. 2 minutes later, they were pointing guns at his head. It started with nothing more than a flicker of red and blue in the rearview mirror. Just lights on a dark stretch of Tennessee highway. Malik Henderson didn't flinch. He was used to night drives, used to solitude. After all, being a senior FBI field officer meant long hours, longer silences, and very few people you could trust at the end of the day. He was on his way to Nashville, driving straight from a high-security briefing in Atlanta. There were no shortcuts when your mother was fighting cancer alone in a hospital bed. The road was empty. The silence was clean. He wasn't speeding. No taillights out. No broken signals. No reason to be stopped. Except for one. Malik was a black man in a dark suit, driving a government-plated SUV just past midnight. He eased the vehicle to the shoulder with calm precision, activated the dome light, and kept both hands clearly on the wheel. He had given this same advice in every community outreach seminar he'd ever taught. Be visible, be polite, be safe. He didn't reach for his license yet, didn't touch his badge, just waited. The cruiser pulled in hot behind him. The door slammed. A heavy figure approached on the driver's side, flashlight beams slicing through the dark like accusation. The second officer lingered near the back of the SUV, hands too close to his holster. Malik caught the angle in the mirror and already knew. This was going sideways. License and registration, the first officer snapped. No greeting, no explanation. Reaching to the right, Malik said calmly. He moved slowly, deliberately. Produced both his government ID and his FBI badge, held them out flat in one palm. The light caught the gold inlay on his identification as the officer leaned in for a closer look. Then he laughed. "No she," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Hey, Jenkins, get a load of this. We got ourselves the effing FBI." The other officer walked up slowly, smirking like it was a private joke. Malik said nothing. He'd seen this before. He'd read this scene in too many internal reports, watched it play out on too many body cam footages that never made it to the public. "You one of those Quantico guys?" the second officer asked mockingly. "Where's your little earpiece? Where's your backup?" Neither officer took the ID. Neither verified anything. "What division are you with, Agent 007? The first one, Riggs, according to his tag, added with a chuckle. "You think this little laminated card's gonna get you out of something?" "This isn't a prank," Malik replied, voice even. "That's a federal ID. You're interfering with— Step out of the vehicle." The words landed like a threat. The shift in tone was immediate. That wasn't a request. That was escalation. Malik hesitated. "I haven't been told why I was stopped." "Step." "Outside office, the vehicle," Riggs repeated, his hand now resting squarely on his sidearm. Malik's muscles tensed, but his training kicked in. He raised his hands higher, unlocked the door with his thumb, and stepped out. The cold hit his skin like voltage, but the real chill was in the eyes of the two men who didn't care who he was. Riggs and Jenkins stood outside, still laughing, still pretending like they were in control. They didn't see the small, unobtrusive smartwatch on Malik's left wrist. They didn't notice the silent ping he'd activated while his hands were on the wheel. They didn't know his team in Nashville had already received a GPS flag and was preparing to deploy. And they definitely didn't notice the woman standing across the street at the gas station, watching, filming, bearing witness to the absurdity of two officers laughing at a federal agent's badge, then throwing him in cuffs. She didn't say a word, but she didn't stop recording. This wasn't just another traffic stop gone wrong. This was the moment the system made the mistake of trying to destroy the wrong man, and it had no idea what was coming next. Inside the back of the patrol car, Malik Henderson felt the kind of stillness that didn't come from peace. It came from restraint. His hands were cuffed tightly behind him, wrists burning. His breath moved evenly, but not because he wasn't angry. He was controlling the space between rage and survival, holding back the part of himself that wanted to scream. On the outside, he remained composed. But on the inside, something was splintering. The voices of the two officers filtered in through the cracked front window. Riggs was laughing again, louder now, like this was a bar joke that just kept getting better. "I mean, if he's FBI, I'm the damn director," Riggs said. Jenkins, leaning casually against the hood, snorted. What kind of agent drives an SUV with no backup, no sidearm, no attitude? The guy looks like a community college professor. They still hadn't run his ID. Still hadn't called it in. Because this wasn't about protocol. It was about ego. And power. And what happens when two men who are used to being in control meet someone who quietly commands more of it than they ever will? Malik had been through tactical debriefs, classified operations, embassy-level negotiations. He had stood across from warlords and bombed out villages who had more respect than these men. He'd trained SWAT teams on de-escalation, consulted with DC on community policing policy. He had worked his entire adult life to improve the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. And now the very people he had tried to protect from themselves had him locked in the back of a car like a criminal. He didn't even blame them entirely. That's what made it worse. He blamed the culture that trained them, the silence that shaped them, the system that told them certain faces were threats before a word was spoken. His shoulder pressed into the hard seat as the car jolted slightly. Riggs had opened the door. "You got anything on you we should know about, Agent?" he sneered. "No weapons, no drugs, nothing illegal," Malik said evenly. Riggs nodded to Jenkins. "Search the vehicle." Malik stiffened. "You don't have probable cause. That's a government vehicle." "You're cuffed, pal. You don't get to lecture me on the Constitution." Jenkins popped the trunk. Malik couldn't see what he was doing, but he heard the shuffling. His files were back there, locked. Sensitive documents stamped with FBI classification. If they breached those, it wasn't just a violation, it was a federal offense. But what would they care? They hadn't cared about his ID. Why would a seal stamped in red ink slow them down now? He leaned his head back against the window, not because he was giving up, but because he needed the glass to cool the fire rising behind his eyes. He thought of his first day at the bureau. Freshly cut hair, stiff collar. His mentor, a Korean-American former profiler named June Park, had looked him square in the eye and said, "They'll respect you for your work, but they'll remember you by your restraint. Never forget which one saves your life." This was what he meant. From the outside, it looked like compliance. From the inside, it was controlled resistance. Every muscle in Malik's body wanted to push, to yell, to pull his credentials out and shove them in their faces. But he didn't. Because this wasn't about pride. It was about surviving long enough to hold them accountable with something far more dangerous than anger. Proof. Riggs slammed the trunk shut. Jenkins returned, his face unreadable. "Nothing back there," he muttered. Riggs shrugged. "Then we got a poser." Malik turned slightly, catching his reflection again in the mirror. That wasn't the face of a man pretending. That was the face of a man being erased. They hadn't just denied his ID. They'd stripped him of his identity. Because to them, he was what they chose to see. And what they chose to see didn't fit their version of power. That was the part they couldn't stomach. Malik didn't look like submission. He didn't act afraid. He spoke clearly, confidently. He reminded them, with every breath, of the hierarchy they weren't sitting at the top of. So they had to break him. Make him small. Make him fold. But he wouldn't. From across the street, the gas station lights flickered. The woman still stood there. She hadn't moved. Still recording. Still silent. And that made her more powerful than any badge in this moment. Malik locked eyes with her through the window. Just for a second. And something passed between them. Not a plea, but a promise. He saw her nod, almost imperceptibly. She wasn't leaving. And neither was the truth. Riggs climbed into the front seat, pulled out his radio. "Got a subject in custody. Claims he's federal. Sending in a request to run the plates." The dispatcher's voice cut in fast. "Unit 44, do not proceed. Vehicle is registered to the Department of Justice. Assigned to active federal personnel. Request immediate location check. Over." Riggs froze. Jenkins leaned in, face paling. "Say again?" "Subject's ID matches active clearance. Name, Malik Henderson. Confirmed with Quantico. Repeat, confirmed. Stand down immediately." Silence. A long, choking silence. Malik didn't say a word. He didn't smile. Didn't blink. The cuffs stayed on. Riggs didn't move. Because even now, even with the facts in front of them, they didn't want to believe it. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was fear. Not of punishment, but of exposure. Because what would happen if this story got out? They'd be just another headline. Another example of what America still gets wrong when it comes to the color of authority. And Malik Henderson? He was going to make damn sure that story was told. The silence in the patrol car wasn't just suffocating. It was strategic. Malik Henderson didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply sat there, wrists still locked in steel, body angled slightly so that the dome light cast his face in half shadow. If they wouldn't see his humanity, they'd be forced to stare at their own reflection in the mistake they'd made. Because now they knew. The dispatcher's voice had broken through their illusion like a hammer through glass. Malik Henderson, FBI, active federal clearance, government vehicle confirmed. Stand down immediately. But they hadn't uncuffed him. Not yet. Riggs sat frozen in the front seat, hands still on the wheel, as if keeping still might reverse what just happened. Jenkins stood outside the cruiser, shifting uncomfortably. You could see the internal war on his face, between what protocol demanded and what pride refused. They had mocked his badge. They had drawn their weapons. They had stripped him of authority. And now they had to face the truth. Malik outranked them both, in title, in power, and in principle. But the road wasn't done writing this chapter. The sound of tires crackling against gravel made everyone turn. A dark sedan, unmarked but unmistakably federal, pulled up behind the cruiser. Its headlights cut across the two officers like a spotlight. The driver's door opened. Then the passengers. Two figures stepped out. Agents Torres and Levin, clean-cut, stern, clad in tailored suits and calm fury. Their presence didn't just change the atmosphere, it reset the temperature entirely. Levin approached first, holding up his badge. Special Agent Levin, Department of Justice. That man in your cruiser is Senior Agent Malik Henderson. He activated his emergency signal 21 minutes ago. You failed to respond. You detained a federal officer without cause. Jenkins blinked. We didn't know. That's the problem, Torres cut in sharply. You didn't care to find out. Levin turned toward the cruiser and gently opened the rear door. Agent Henderson, sir. Malik met his eyes, nodded once, and stepped out. His wrists were red, skin raw from the pressure of the cuffs. Levin removed them carefully, almost ceremonially. Malik didn't rub his wrists. He let the marks stay, visible. Riggs stepped out of the front seat, trying to salvage some fragment of control. This was all just a miss. Don't, Malik said, his voice low and steady. Don't insult yourself like that. Torres moved closer to Jenkins. Do you have any idea how close this came to ending in tragedy? Do you realize what would have happened if he wasn't who he is? Malik turned to face them both. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. His presence spoke louder than their panic. Tell me something, he said to Riggs. If I had been wearing a hoodie and sneakers instead of a suit, would I be alive right now? Neither answered. Would you have searched my car for fun? Pulled your gun because I used words you didn't like? Mocked me while my hands were raised? Still silence. Malik looked across the road. The woman with the phone was still standing there. She hadn't moved an inch. Her camera was still pointed in their direction, capturing the moment from a safe distance, but no longer from the shadows. And next to her now stood another figure. An older white man, maybe late 60s, in a weathered bomber jacket and a military-style cap. His hands were in his pockets, but his eyes were locked on Malik. He stepped forward slowly. I know who you are, the man said. His voice carried the weight of certainty. You saved my son. Malik turned to him, surprised. The man nodded. 3 years ago, Washington, D.C., you pulled him out of a hostage situation during that pharmacy raid. I never forgot your face. The moment cracked open like a thunderclap. Riggs and Jenkins stared in disbelief. You sure you want to keep defending what just happened here? The man added, turning to the two officers. Because I'm pretty damn sure your guns were pointed at a man who could have been your savior. Malik didn't react. Not yet. He was processing, recalibrating. Not because of the recognition, but because of what it meant. Witnesses were no longer watching. They were speaking. The older man turned back to the woman. "You still filming?" She nodded. "From the beginning." Torres looked at Malik. "Sir, we can escort you to the Nashville field office. You're within your rights to file immediate charges." Malik considered it. For a long time. Then he said, "Not here. Not yet." He stepped closer to Riggs, who had turned ghostly pale. "You ever ask yourself why you carry a badge?" Malik asked quietly. Riggs didn't respond. "Is it to protect or to punish?" Malik let the question hang there, suspended in the space between them like a guillotine. Then he turned and walked back toward his vehicle, now cleared and opened by Agent Torres. Levin followed, saying nothing, simply present as backup. The old man called out again. "They do this all the time, you know, just not to someone like you." Malik paused at the door. He looked back once, at the officers, the witnesses, the camera still rolling, and said, "That's exactly the point. And that's exactly why this time, it's not staying quiet." The door closed behind him, but the storm had only begun. By sunrise, the footage had already traveled farther than any of them could have imagined. What began as a private humiliation on a dark Tennessee highway became national outrage by morning. The video, shaky but damning, showed everything. 2 white officers sneering at a black man's FBI badge, dismissing his identity, mocking his authority, and drawing their weapons anyway. The final frame, where a 3rd officer finally uncuffed him, ended not with apology, but with the stunned silence of people who had just realized the ground had shifted beneath their feet. And that silence would not last long. By mid-morning, Malik Henderson sat in a press briefing room inside the Nashville FBI field office. He wasn't in uniform, no suit. Just a plain gray sweater and slacks. Quiet strength wrapped in measured stillness. Around him were agents, legal representatives, and internal affairs officers, all watching him closely. Some were curious. Others, tense. A few, visibly ashamed. He didn't care about their discomfort. Not anymore. Outside the building, journalists gathered in waves. The video had hit the front page of every major outlet. Social media ignited. Hashtags exploded. Henderson was right. Badge means nothing. Respect the black badge. But what cut deepest wasn't the outrage. It was the recognition. People saw themselves in that car. Not just black men, but anyone who'd ever been made small because someone refused to believe their worth. And Malik knew that silence, his silence, would be complicit now. He stepped to the podium at exactly 10 a.m. "I didn't want to be here like this," he began, voice steady. "I didn't want to make headlines. I didn't want to be a symbol. But what happened to me 2 nights ago wasn't just about me. It was about a system that's been built on fear and defended with silence." He paused, letting that settle. The cameras in the room were still. Reporters frozen, pens suspended in air. "They didn't see a federal agent," he continued. "They saw a threat, not because of how I acted, not because of what I did, but because of who they assumed I was, and who they assumed I wasn't." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "What saved me wasn't my badge. It was a woman with a camera. A witness. That's what turned a deadly situation into a conversation." And then his tone shifted, sharper now, not angry, but surgical. "But let me be clear. I am not an exception. I am a reminder, because every day someone without a badge, without a camera, goes through what I did, and too often they don't walk away." The room was silent. No one dared move. He finished with one last truth. "This system doesn't need reform. It needs accountability. And starting today, I intend to be part of that." He stepped back. The silence cracked open into the flurry of shouted questions, but he didn't stay to answer them. He had already said enough. That afternoon, the Department of Justice released a formal statement confirming an internal investigation into the actions of Officers Riggs and Jenkins. Both were placed on administrative leave pending disciplinary review. The Nashville Police Department issued a scripted apology, but no one bought the sincerity. The footage had said too much. Later that evening, Malik sat alone in a private room with Director Alan Browning, head of domestic operations for the FBI. They had known each other for years, worked multiple interagency cases together. Browning was direct, calculating, respected. But even he looked rattled now. "I reviewed everything," he said quietly. "It was beyond unacceptable." Malik didn't nod. He didn't offer relief. "I know." Browning leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "There's going to be political fallout. You understand that?" "I don't care." "You should." "No," Malik said calmly. "They should." That moment shifted something in the room. Browning sat back, studying him differently now. Not just as an agent, but as something more. A voice the agency could no longer afford to ignore. "What do you want, Malik?" Malik didn't hesitate. "Transparency. A full internal review of police interactions with federal officers. I want every racial profiling complaint from the last 10 years unsealed. I want systemic training implemented nationwide for field officers. Starting now, not next year, not after another press cycle. Now." Browning raised an eyebrow. "That's a tall order." Malik folded his hands. "So is burying someone who should still be alive." He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just held the man's gaze like a mirror. Later that week, the FBI issued a joint task force mandate to begin internal training protocols focusing on racial bias, de-escalation, and field identification verification. It was the beginning of a movement, not because it fixed everything, but because for once, someone didn't shut the door quietly and move on. The public kept watching. And Malik didn't let the momentum fade. He made appearances, not on morning talk shows, but at community town halls, department conferences, and private roundtables where policy was written and usually left unscrutinized. He wasn't interested in celebrity. He was interested in consequence. One day, standing before a group of new recruits, he said, "Your badge doesn't give you power. It gives you responsibility. If that's not why you're here, leave now. Because power without humility becomes tyranny. And I won't stand for it anymore." The room was silent. One young recruit raised his hand and asked what Malik would have done differently that night if he hadn't had his badge. Malik looked him in the eye and answered, "I'd probably be dead." There was no dramatic music, no applause. Just the weight of truth settling in a room full of people still learning how to carry it. And outside, the country kept watching. Because silence had finally been broken. And systems don't shake on their own. Someone has to speak first. The fire didn't burn out. It evolved. Weeks after the incident, Malik Henderson found himself in a space far removed from flashing lights and steel handcuffs. He stood in front of a crowd of cadets in a large, high-ceilinged training auditorium just outside Baltimore. His suit was pressed, his tone calm, but his presence electrified the air. These weren't just students of law enforcement. They were the future stewards of justice. And Malik wasn't here to lecture. He was here to light a match. He walked the stage without a mic. His voice carried without effort. "Let me ask you something," he began. "How many of you joined because you wanted to protect people?" Most hands went up, tentative, unsure if it was a test. He nodded. "Good," he said. "Now how many of you were taught to protect people who don't look like you? Think like you? Live like you?" The room was still. No hands moved. "That silence right there," Malik continued, "is where most of our problems start." He wasn't angry. He was precise. Every word he spoke had weight, because it came from lived reality. He wasn't theorizing about injustice. He had worn it, felt it tighten around his wrists, seen it flicker across a flashlight beam, drawn like a weapon at his face. He now led a nationwide task force called STAR, Systemic Training Against Racialism, formed in direct response to the viral traffic stop. It wasn't symbolic. It was operational, and Malik made sure of that. They developed training programs rooted not just in law but in humanity. Scenario-based modules, real-world de-escalation, conscious bias testing, emotional regulation, active listening. For some, these were new concepts. For Malik, they were survival skills the system should have taught decades ago. He didn't just visit precincts, he embedded himself. One week he was in Tulsa, the next in Oakland, then Chicago, Baton Rouge, and back through rural counties where cell service faded, but suspicion ran deep. And everywhere he went, he told the same story. Not just about what happened to him, but about what would have happened if no one had been watching. The footage was now used in over 30 academies as a primary case study. Not to demonize the officers, but to show the anatomy of assumptions. How milliseconds of arrogance could unravel lives. How institutional pride had become a mask for personal fear. But Malik's vision stretched farther. He advocated for transparency dashboards showing complaint histories and disciplinary records for every officer in the nation. He partnered with legal analysts to create accountability legislation modeled after military conduct codes. And he pushed for the creation of citizen review boards with real authority, not just ceremonial seats at the table. It was a war, not of weapons, but of will. And Malik had plenty. One late afternoon, after a long day of training local sheriff deputies in Mobile, Alabama, he found himself standing alone by a set of bleachers behind the station. The sun had dipped low, painting the concrete in orange light. A young officer, maybe 26, approached quietly. "Sir," the man said, awkward, nervous. "Can I ask you something?" "Ask you?" Malik nodded. "I saw the video, and I wanted to say I'm sorry." Malik looked at him. Not with disdain, not with applause. "For what?" The officer hesitated. "For not believing it could happen. For thinking, maybe you provoked it. I watched it the first time with that in my head. But by the end, I couldn't stop thinking. What if it had been me? My father's black. I've never really talked about that." Malik didn't offer a simple response. He let the words settle. Because honesty deserved space. "Then now is the time to start talking," he said. "With your precinct, with your family, with yourself." The officer nodded, swallowing hard. "I will." Moments like that weren't headlines. But they were change. Quiet, slow-burning change. The kind that doesn't trend but transforms. Still, not everything was transformation. There were threats, hate mail, editorials calling him a race agitator, or accusing him of undermining police unity. Some colleagues distanced themselves. Others, behind closed doors, admitted they were scared of what his leadership might mean. But Malik didn't flinch. He remembered what his mother had once whispered over the phone after he returned home that night, still shaking from adrenaline. "They tried to make you feel small," she said softly. "But you rose. You rose so they couldn't shrink someone else." And he held on to that. One morning, weeks later, he walked back into her hospital room with the news she had been waiting to hear. The tumor had shrunk. The treatments were working. And for the first time in months, her voice held hope again. "You've been carrying the world on your back," she told him, brushing his cheek with a hand that had grown fragile. "But don't forget, what you carry isn't a burden. It's a calling." He sat beside her for hours that day. No suit, no briefing. Just a son beside his mother, breathing in the calm between battles. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer his alone. Communities had begun organizing around policy change. Departments were reevaluating their training. Cities were inviting oversight where they once feared transparency. And across every screen, Malik's story remained. Not as a symbol of suffering, but as a blueprint for accountability. He hadn't set out to be a public figure. He had simply refused to be erased. And that refusal sparked something no badge could contain, because systems don't change by accident. They change when someone refuses to shrink beneath them. Malik Henderson had been forced to his knees, but he chose to stand. And the country had no choice but to stand up too. Malik Henderson's story is not just one of injustice. It's one of profound transformation, resilience, and a refusal to be silent. What began as a routine drive home turned into a public takedown of a federal officer, not because of any wrongdoing, but because two local police officers refused to look past his skin color. In those few minutes on the side of a Tennessee highway, Malik's years of service, his badge, and his dignity were all dismissed. But what those officers didn't realize was that the man they tried to diminish had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. Not with violence, not with retaliation, but with vision, discipline, and an unshakable belief in justice. Instead of letting rage consume him, Malik chose to take action. He turned humiliation into momentum, pain into policy, and silence into a platform. From launching a national task force on racial bias to transforming the way law enforcement trains future officers, Malik didn't just reclaim his power, he redirected it. He showed us all that true leadership doesn't come from rank or recognition. It comes from how we respond when the world tries to strip us of who we are. Through his journey, he reminded us that the most dangerous thing about injustice is not the act itself, but the silence that often follows. It's the quiet acceptance, the "it's not my problem," the turning away when it doesn't happen to us. Malik could have walked away. He could have gone back to his office, buried the footage, and let it fade into memory. But he didn't. He stood up. And because he did, others started standing with him. The lesson from Malik's story is clear. Don't underestimate the impact of standing your ground with integrity. Whether you're in a position of power or simply a witness to wrong, you have a choice: to be silent or to be the one who speaks when it matters most. We live in a time where change feels overwhelming, where division feels constant, and where doing the right thing can come at a cost. But Malik's story proves that one voice, when grounded in purpose, can shake entire systems. So how can we apply this in our lives today? Start by paying attention. Speak up when you see bias, especially in everyday moments. Support those who challenge injustice. Vote with values. Educate your children and your communities about the power of empathy and accountability. And most of all, refuse to normalize the unacceptable. Because silence, as we've seen, protects the oppressor, not the oppressed. If Malik's journey moved you, challenged you, or inspired you to think differently, we invite you to join us. Subscribe to the channel, share this story, and help us continue to shine a light on voices that deserve to be heard. Your support gives us the fuel to keep creating content that matters. Content that doesn't just inform, but ignites. Because stories like Malik's don't end with one man. They begin with all of us.